Hi, I'm Tom Payne, publisher for Trinity University Press. Elephants are the planet's greatest land animals, but they are disappearing in such numbers as to possibly go extinct by the end of this century. Welcome to this discussion, Elephants, We Hardly Knew Them. Our guests will explore the science as well as the folklore, mythology, and spirituality of these grand and mysterious creatures that we simultaneously adore and misunderstand. It's my honor to introduce those joining us in the discussion. Dale Peterson is the author of the newly published book, 33 Ways of Looking at an Elephant, from Trinity University Press. In addition to numerous accolades, he's the author of many books, including Jane Goodall, The Woman Who Redefined Man, Elephant Reflections, Giraffe Reflections, The Moral Lives of Animals, and The Ghosts of Gombe, two of which have been honored as New York Times Notable Books of the Year. A few years ago, he and Mark Bekoff co-edited The Jane Effect, Celebrating Jane Goodall, also published by Trinity University Press. Dale teaches at Tufts University. Felicia Nutter is the Director of International Veterinary Medicine at Tufts University, work that has seen her research and service across the US, as well as from Southeast Asia to East Africa, where she conducted extensive work with chimpanzees, baboons, and gorillas. The recipient of a Fulbright, she later returned to Africa under the USAID Emerging Pandemic Threats Program to continue her work with animals and infectious diseases. Carl Safina is a widely recognized figure on animals and their evolving relationships with humans, seen in or on CNN, PBS, the New York Times, The Guardian, and many other such outlets. He is the author of the acclaimed book, Song for the Ocean Blue, as well as What Animals Think and Feel, Beyond Words, The View from Lazy Point, Becoming Wild, and others. He has been awarded a MacArthur, Pew, and Guggenheim Prize, in addition to numerous other awards. And he founded and runs the acclaimed Safina Center and lives on Long Island. Allen Rutberg is the director of the Tufts Center for Animals and Public Policy and research associate professor at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine. His work focuses on human-wildlife conflicts in urban and suburban areas, especially the application of non-invasive fertility control to reduce conflicts between people and deer. Indeed, the challenge with such a statured group of folks is the tension between doing service to the breadth of their amazing work while also not eating up too much of our valuable time tonight. Quickly, several of the books mentioned are available for sale at a 20% discount using the discount code TUFTS. You can also find that in the chat box. Included is 33 Ways of Looking at an Elephant. As I said, the first new book in our Looking at Animals book series from Trinity University Press. A portion of all of the sales supports the Tufts Elephant Conservation Alliance. Please visit us also at tupress.org for more information. With that, thank you for joining us, and I'm proud to introduce Allen Rutberg, who will guide the discussion.
Thank you, Tom. I'm honored and thrilled to be here to help discuss this wonderful book. Again, my name is Allen Rutberg. I am the director of the Tufts Center for Animals and Public Policy, as well as the director of the master's program that we administer. I found the breadth of this book really impressive. And what most impressed me really is the central sections about the behavior of elephants. And a lot of the early work on elephants, the early discoveries by Douglas Hamilton and other folks came as I was a very impressionable high school and college student. And it seemed like every other month, a book would come out with a whole set of revelations about a new species that we really knew nothing about in the wild. And of course, Jane Goodall's In the Shadow of Man was the first of those. And I still have my scraggly 1971 copy of that book. But one of the books that I also read at that time was Ian and Douglas Hamilton's Among the Elephants. And I also still have that copy, which is 45 years old. I still had it on my shelf. And really what all this shows is that the title of this seminar, Elephants We Hardly Knew You, is really reflective of the fact that we've really known about or started to learn about wild species like elephants maybe 50 years ago, and that we have just started to scratch the surface of our knowledge and understanding of all these species, and all that new knowledge and all those new worlds that were appearing in the late 60s, mid 70s, really was the beginning of something. And I hope that, as we all do here, that that we have these animals around for a long time, and that we can understand them better and appreciate them better. So I will start asking Dale about how he came to write this book and what challenges he found in writing it. And before you start, Dale, if people have questions, please put them in the chat and we will sort through them and hopefully answer some of them. So Dale, tell us about your book.
Okay, Alan, thank you. Okay, I'm not a scientist. I'm not really an elephant expert or a biologist. I have a PhD in English, and I've taught English for many years at Tufts. And in fact, I've just retired just this year. But I've also written about animals for much of my life, and I've traveled a lot in Africa looking at animals. So I have essentially two careers. One is a teacher of English, and one is of a traveler and a writer of books about animals and other subjects. This book began really 15 years ago when a major publisher gave me significant money to write the text for a photographic book on elephants. And I didn't know a thing about elephants, but I did know about Africa, and I knew about, apes and other animals. So I felt I could do it, and it seemed like a wonderful thing to do. First, however, I had to educate myself. And so the start of my education was travel. I went to Africa to see the two African species, African savanna and African forest elephants, two different species. And with the photographer, we went to Kenya and East Africa and to the Samburu Reserve, and also to Amboseli, which is probably the most spectacular and wonderful place in the world to see savanna elephants. We photographed them, we watched them, we spent time following them, and so on. And then from there, we went west to the other side of Africa, to Central African Republic, to look at forest elephants in Congo Basin Forest. And there we went to a place called Zanga-Sanga, and it's a place that's open to scientific observers and other people who managed to get there. And you can watch elephants from a platform in the trees, high in the trees, as they come into a clearing in the forest. And essentially they come in to have fun with each other, to bathe, and to eat the soil, which is rich in minerals. So it's actually a spectacular place to see elephants in their normal behavior, enjoying themselves. There are poachers around, but nevertheless, they're usually not there, and they weren't there when we were there. So that was the second really spectacular trip, and I learned more about what elephants look like and what they do. And then the third trip took me to Asia to see the third species, Asian elephants, and I went to Myanmar, into the mountains of northeastern Myanmar, where there are wild elephants in those forests, and there are also elephants that were wild and been captured and tamed and trained to work in logging. And so we spent our time in a logging camp, watching the elephants there. It was a wonderful week. 2 days in, riding elephant back to get there, and 2 days out riding elephant back to get there. And that for me was, kind of the first time when I really began to wonder and be amazed by these spectacular animals. They're so emotional and so intelligent. You know, I learned, you know, a lot of things, such as how Hannibal managed to cross the Alps in 218 BC with 37 war elephants and surprise the Romans, because elephants are surprisingly, amazingly sure-footed in very, very rugged mountains. And that's one of the first things you need to know, that you wouldn't guess, because you think they're big and clumsy. They're not big and clumsy. They're big and very careful and very skilled in going through extremely rugged and difficult terrain. And as I learned, even if one foot slips off the edge of a cliff, you still have 3 feet left. And they, you know, they can deal with it. So I also learned that elephants, if a baby elephant needs to nurse, everything else stops. Babies come first in elephant society, and mothers come second. I also learned what an elephant tongue feels like, because I was able to feed an elephant and touch a tongue. And I learned, you know, what a tusk feels like on a living elephant, and so on. So that was probably the beautiful, best time of my field experience with elephants. We got wonderful photographs. And then, of course, it was time to do library research. And this book, 33 Ways of Looking at an Elephant, is the result of that library research. In the process of doing research for the first book, I didn't read everything there is written about elephants. I think that's impossible. But I learned what it was and where it was. And I also learned what the best pieces are. And those are the pieces that, when I came back to do this second book, it's an anthology, by the way. I put together 33 excerpts from the best writing and the most interesting writing in, you know, that has ever been written in English about elephants, in my opinion. I think I've answered your question. Maybe I haven't.
Yeah. Were there the book does include very different ways of looking at the elephant, and so you have classical historical perspectives from Aristotle and others. You have history from the colonial era, and then you have a big central section about elephant behavior and then cognition. Was there a particular part of it that you really enjoyed the most?
Well, I enjoyed many parts of it, but for different reasons. But you're absolutely right that there's this amazing division between the pre-modern era and then the modern era, starting in about 1965, when the very first elephant behavioral studies began. Before that, people didn't even know the structure of elephant society. So that was, that was a wonderful moment. I also, there were other parts where, the classical material, some of it's not easy. I think Aristotle is not exactly fun to read, but it's so interesting and so amazing that this man living, in the 4th century BC wrote, what he wrote was so accurate that it wasn't, it really couldn't be challenged until the 19th century, much of it. And that in itself is pretty impressive and pretty wonderful. I also pulled out a piece from the Sanskrit literature. The first people to capture and learn how to tame and train elephants were the people living in the Indian subcontinent 4,000 years ago. And so there's actually a literature written in Sanskrit about elephants, but it's largely practical literature about how to capture them, how to tame them, how to train them. Surprisingly practical, and also surprising that the methods used then are still used today, and certainly well into the 19th century, into the 20th century. Even the actual, tools of control, like the elephant hook, were originally invented, 4,000, 3,000 years ago by the people of Indus Valley civilization. So there's so much that's interesting in the ancient literature, and I just found it all really quite fascinating. I also included African folk tales, which are wonderful. And then, the most troubling literature, I think, was the colonial literature, in which you have a series of elephant hunters who like to go out and just kill animals and, kill the bigger the better. And so they're killing elephants, and then they write these books boasting about it. And it's not the sort of thing that gives me a lot of pleasure to read about, but they're still, nevertheless, interesting material to look at. Some of that is in the book. And there are some fictional pieces that I really quite enjoyed too, and they're in the book. There's a piece written by a Vietnamese author for young readers that was published in the middle of the 20th century. And it's from the perspective of the North Vietnamese. So it talks about the invasion of the Americans and the French, and how the elephants are used, or at least one elephant, the star of the book, was used as a war elephant to help fight against the invaders from them. It's a really kind of a fascinating book, and a surprisingly accurate book about the use of elephants in labor. So it's actually, really, you could read it almost as a handbook on how to capture, tame, and train an elephant. It's an amazing book. There's also a Japanese children's story written after World War II, based on this very sad story of 3 elephants in a Tokyo zoo. Once the Americans started bombing Tokyo, the Japanese army dictated that all large animals had to be killed because of the danger of zoos being broken open and animals running wild in the streets. So the zoos poisoned all of their animals, but these 3 elephants were smart enough not to take the poison. And so they starved to death. It's an extremely sad story, but it's turned into a children's book that, for me is a little too grim for my children, but apparently it's a classic in Japan. It's gone through more than 100 editions. So anyway, those are highlights of books that I really loved getting at. Oh, and I'll mention one other that's a scientific book that I think is, in my mind, one of the best, very best books ever written about elephants. And that's Silent Thunder by Katie Payne, a woman who discovered that elephants communicate with each other infrasonically below the range of human hearing over very long distances. She discovered that and then demonstrated it scientifically. And so now we know, and she demonstrated that they could communicate over a distance of 2.5 miles, which would make an area of about 50 square miles, amazingly. And but it's not the science that I love about the book, it's just the writing is spectacular. And as putting together this anthology, I really looked for pieces that really read well and that were either literate or literary. And this is literary. It's just beautifully written, just the best thing I've ever read about elephants. So that's in there as well.
All right. Well, speaking of great writing about elephants, Carl, you have an excerpt in the book, and one of the things you talk about is anthropomorphism, the sin of anthropomorphism, which I've certainly experienced too. I've been chastised for giving names to my animals, and what do you think is the origin of this anthropomorphism, and why is it so persistent as we learn so much more about the capacities, the cognitive and emotional capacities of animals? It's still there. What do you think keeps it going on? You have to unmute yourself.
The idea you're referring to with this awkward word anthropomorphism is the proscription against it. What it is attributing human thoughts and emotions to non-humans. And in many reaches of behavioral science and science journalism, it is a sin, and you may not attribute human thoughts and emotions to non-humans. Simply put on its face, that is completely unscientific, because science is supposed to believe what the evidence leads you to. It's not supposed to tell you ahead of time what you're allowed to think and what you're not allowed to think. Where it came from, I believe, as I understand it, is that when some really brilliant scientists in the middle of the 20th century, like Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen and a few others, were trying to make a science out of animal behavior, they needed to sweep away centuries of mythology and folklore and fables. So the idea that foxes are clever and ants are industrious and grasshoppers are lazy, that had to all go away. And they said, we're just going to watch what animals do. We're going to describe what animals do, and that's going to be the science. And they said, we don't know what they're thinking. We can't know what they're thinking. So we won't say, and we cannot say, and we will not say what's going on in their minds, if they have minds. And we're just going to stay away from any question of their inner life, because we cannot scientifically access that. Now, that got taught, and it got taught to generations of students. It got taught to me in the 1970s. But meanwhile, starting in the 1960s, people started to actually study what certain wild animals are doing, including elephants, chimpanzees, a few others. And then that all mushroomed into many thousands of studies that are ongoing right now. And we have neurobiology, which was essentially non-existent in the 1950s, which now we know many things about how minds work, how brains work. We can watch them. We can watch brain waves. We can compare the brain waves of a dreaming human being to that of a dreaming cat, a dreaming rat, a dreaming octopus, for that matter, and note all the similarities. The gathering principle of all of biology is that we are all related through the process of evolution. Everything alive today is a survivor of 1 billion years of evolution, with no breaks from the beginning, because we're all in one sweep of the enterprise of life on this planet, all organically related. We inherit everything we have from somewhere. That includes, our skeletons. We have human skeletons. That doesn't mean that only humans have skeletons. We have stomachs and muscles and hearts and intestines. That doesn't mean that only humans have stomachs, muscles, hearts, and intestines. And then we get to the mind and we say, only humans have minds. Well, this is ridiculous. It goes in the face of everything we know. It's unscientific to think that way. And it violates the overlying and underpinning principle of biology, which is the organic relationship of all of living things. Why does it persist? Partly because it's still taught, partly because it spoils, to unteach it and unlearn it spoils our favorite story, which is that we are the only ones that matter, and we're the best, we are above all, we are beside all. And if we consider that other creatures have thoughts and emotions, can experience a range of feelings from well-being to fear to misery, then it makes a lot of what we do to other animals unpleasant to contemplate, and it spoils our fun. So that's, I think, why. And I think then you have people like journalists who just are taught, you can't do this. They're not biologists and scientists. They're not, as journalists, they're taught they're not entitled to have their own opinion about things. And so they just keep persisting on this. But if you talk to every field scientist that I've ever talked to, they just don't feel that way at all, because it's very obvious that other animals have feelings, that they make plans, at least short-term plans. They know where they're going. They know who they're with. They know what they're doing. They want to stay alive. They have friends, allies, enemies. They understand what's going on. They feel bold and protective when that's appropriate. They feel fearful when that's appropriate. And all of these things are blindingly obvious if you actually look at and study non-human beings.
Yeah, I've done some field work on wild horses, and I remember being at a meeting, an Interior Department meeting, maybe 20 years ago, where an equine veterinarian was asked to describe horses and what horses' needs are, and it was a completely one-dimensional picture of horses as creatures that had no past and no future and no understanding and no plans, and to whom we only owed a humane life and a good death. And there was nothing more to them than that. And I just didn't recognize those animals, because the animals that I had spent time with, the horses on Assateague, clearly had long-term relationships. They seemed to be almost strategizing sometime. And they certainly were looking towards the past and towards the future. And there is this unfortunate tendency for people to make animals so one-dimensional, and they exist only in the human world, as they do in really the first two sections of Dale's book. It's about people, and elephants are just objects. So that's a tough problem, but clearly they're not just objects. So
well, one of the problems is that almost nobody actually gets to spend time with non-humans. The major exception is dogs and cats. Not everybody has a dog or a cat. Many people do. But basically nobody watches elephants. You may, if you get the privilege to go to Africa or somewhere else where there are elephants, usually it's just, oh, there are elephants. You don't sit there and watch them for hours, for days, for years. You don't actually understand anything about their relationships. And then you just, take a few pictures and move along. Very, very few people actually sit and watch and try to understand firsthand what other animals are doing. And that's a big stumbling block in our understanding.
Yeah, Felicia and I were talking about this yesterday in terms of dogs and cats and domestic animals, horses and cows, and that people have known for a long time that these animals are individuals. So what's your thinking about this, Felicia?
Well, I wanted to thank, before we move, I wanted to thank Carl for your I think it's a very elegant and succinct rebuttal of anthropomorphism, because you say that people forget the key leveling detail that humans are animals. And I remind people all the time, I say, humans and other animals, or talk about, great apes and, humans and other primates. So I thank you for including that in the book that you've written.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's just a very nice, a very short, succinct way to remember to refute that. Yeah, I think, and Dale, you wrote about that too in the introduction to this section, that many of us have our own anecdotal understanding, our own anecdotal stories about relationships with animals, perhaps dogs or cats, or maybe a squirrel we see in the backyard, or what other animals we might have the opportunity to have relationships with. But that's fundamentally different from gathering a body of observational data and scientific knowledge that can show us, more length of time and more complexity about relationships that these animals have. And so I think that that's a very fair point about the differences between those two types of experiences. And also, we can, I think Carl's section that's included in the book also hints at this, if we approached studying other humans the way that we approach studying animals, we can't assign any emotions to humans either. If we take that same guiding principle that, well, we can't assume what's going on in another creature's brain because we're not there and we don't know, then anthropomorphism and the sin of that would dictate that we can't assign emotions to humans. And we know that we do. So I think it's an important change that happened. It's one that happened also at the time that I was a child, reading National Geographic and watching really important documentaries on TV that really framed the way that I thought about animals and thought about studying animals. And I think some of the strokes of genius that we all experienced in that era, perhaps were things that Louis Leakey did, decisions he made to send unscientifically trained people that were good observers to do major studies or to start major studies of some of our closest relatives, right? Jane Goodall and the chimpanzees, Diane Fossey and gorillas, Baruti Galdikas and orangutans. Cynthia Moss and others did similar work with elephants, just sort of going, perhaps not trained as scientists at the time that they started, becoming, scientists and getting PhDs along the way, but really just observing and describing realistically what they saw without that filter saying, no, you can't recognize that the animals might have emotions or might have some sort of complexity or feelings, or that they play, crazy things like that. So those are really fundamental changes that happened in that period of time, and we're still recovering, from the earlier history of the things that we were taught.
Some of the sections about altruism and death in the book really raise some interesting questions about the source of these behaviors. They don't seem to be simply adaptive in the sort of, again, the kind of one-dimensional Darwinian sense of things. Dale, what was your reaction to those writings?
About altruism? Well, of course, I love it. And it is a problem. And in sort of high school evolution, it's hard to explain, but when you understand evolution as a more complex thing, you can understand theoretically why altruism is possible among animals, and particularly among large-brained animals like elephants. But you also have the wonderful, simple observations of altruism. Elephants are amazing for their helping behavior. And there are tons and tons of anecdotal stories about, a human being injured and rescued by elephants, and, or watching elephants rescue each other. And of course, these are not scientific, they're stories, they're anecdotes, but there are some wonderful scientific observations of empathy and altruism. And my favorite, of course, is the one by Katie Payne that was done after observing at Zanga Sanga, the group of forest elephants, observing elephants' reaction to a young elephant who was dying of malnutrition, dying on one day and dead on the second day. And she videotaped the whole thing. And so had a wonderful record of the reaction of 129 elephants who walked on the path past this dying and then dead elephant, and their reactions. And their reactions were amazingly surprising. The not surprising part was about half of them, upon seeing an elephant dead or dying, went the other way. They took off and they understood that it may be danger. And so it's a fear reaction is a natural reaction, but the other half did not react with fear. Instead, they reacted with helping behavior. And that for me it's the best field observation I know of about helping behavior among elephants. So that's in the book, of course, and it's a wonderful piece to read. I compare it to the Good Samaritan story, where, you know, the story in the Bible where three individuals walked past a man who had been injured and lying on the ground. Two of them went the other way. They realized that there could be robbers around, and so they were naturally afraid. But a third one stopped and helped. And that's really what you're seeing in the study of elephants, is that same thing. A significant number, more than half, stop to help or try to help. So, you know, that's one of the things that's special about elephants. I don't think altruism at that level, I'm not sure it's characteristic of all large mammal species, but I really think that's one of the special things about elephants. They're very, very empathetic.
Yeah, I mean, we noticed the empathy, but also the variability that, you know, not
Right.
all elephants are alike, that they do
Right.
different things in response to the same situation.
Yeah, and I, as a writer, whenever I see somebody talking about the elephant,
right.
my
Which
my
one?
reaction is, no, it's the elephants. They're individuals. It's not a single unit. So anyway.
So, so what kind of capacities, maybe Carl, you want to address it, what kind of cognitive capacities produce both that variability and that understanding of the situations that other creatures, that different creatures are finding themselves in? What you have to be smart, you have to have some capacity, and again, it seems like this was operating in a sphere that wasn't specifically a Darwinian sphere. A lot of what was described was behavior that seems like it can't be explained by simple survival and reproduction sorts of things that, you know, we used to do a lot.
Let me just take the Darwinian comment for a moment. Presumably, because I don't think there's any other way around it, everything that we see is a result of the process of evolution on Earth. One of the very weirdest things about the discussion of altruism is how many people will say it's theoretically impossible, or will try to explain it away, or will tie themselves in knots trying to reach an explanation in which an animal, well, first of all, you know, what is altruism? Altruism is when you incur a cost to help another individual. That's what altruism is. So they'll say, well, the cost is an investment that later on it will come back and help them, and so it's not really altruism, it's really selfish, and all of these semantic things. This is trying to back into the problem exactly wrong. The fact is, you see altruism sometimes in some species, in humans, in chimpanzees, in dolphins, in elephants, in a number of others. You see attempts at altruism in creatures that don't have hands and aren't very well equipped to do a lot of helping, but show empathy, including things like dogs and wolves and other social animals. Since you see it, if you can't explain it with your theory, there's something wrong with your theory. There's not something wrong with the fact that it exists. There's something wrong with the way you look at the world. I firmly believe that everything we see has evolved. There's no other way around that. But there are benefits to helping. And the benefits to helping may not accrue to the individual. They may accrue to the group. Now, in evolutionary theory, another thing that we've been taught for decades is, oh, there's no such thing as group selection. All selection is about individuals. It has to be selfish or it doesn't work. Well, this is patently ridiculous. You can have selection for a group or against a group. Here's an example. Birds on an island lose the capacity for flight. So the whole species is flightless. There are a lot of birds on islands that are flightless. Sea level rises, they all die. The species goes extinct. That's group selection. End of story. So some of the ways that people have thought about the idea of selection are, you know, they're not actually the way that Darwin would think. Darwin looked at things and wondered about what principles of what is happening can make sense of what we're seeing. And then you have these ossified people who are taught these rules who say, well, it all has to be selfish. So therefore, if we see somebody who's helping an individual, it can't really be happening. It must be some aberration. And that just shows a deficit in thinking. Now, you know, what attributes have to be in play for another creature to show altruism? Probably they are a social species. Probably the other individual is a member of their social group. They probably know them as an individual. Social species tend to be more intelligent. What do we mean by intelligent? Usually we mean that when we're confronted with a novel situation, we can figure out some approach to it. It's not always the same. It's not always a situation we've seen before, and we may do something novel in the face of a new situation. And that's what we seem to see in some other species, including elephants. There are stories of elephants injuring people badly, defensively, and then guarding them through the night or taking care of them or making sure that they're covered with leaves and vegetation to try to protect them from attack, while the elephant family moved on, and the elephant that was involved in that interaction stayed with that individual into the next day until people searching for them found them. So, you know, there's just a lot that goes on in the non-human world without humans seeing it. And when we do see things, which most of those things are relatively new, just in the last few decades, as we've mentioned. And we do see things that involve altruism. A leopard attacks a chimpanzee. Another chimpanzee nearby attacks the leopard. The leopard turns and delivers a fatal injury to the one who was trying to attack the leopard on behalf of the other. Well, that's altruism. So, you know, don't tell us that it's not theoretically possible. Adjust your theories to a better understanding of the world. That's what I think about that.
All right. So
Give that
let's
that's a good one.
let's turn to conservation a little bit. Felicia, what role do you think veterinarians have in elephant conservation? Because we do want to keep these creatures around now that we're starting to figure out how fabulous they are.
Yeah, we sure do. Well, it's highlighted at a few points in the book. I think actually in the Big Love excerpt that it's mentioned that there was an elephant that had sustained a spear wound, and a veterinarian came, presumably from Kenya Wildlife Service, I think, to administer antibiotics and painkillers. So, and elsewhere in Saving the Antelopes, there's mentions about the veterinarians that are translocating the elephants. So those are really some of the main roles for veterinarians, dealing with wildlife health and elephant health in the wild. So emergency response to things that happen to elephants, human-induced life-threatening issues where there is the capacity to respond. So there's some really excellent veterinarians that are doing amazing work with emergency response with Kenya Wildlife Service and some NGOs. It's easier with savanna elephants than it is with forest elephants. I've been involved in some of the attempts to try to locate forest elephants that have snare injuries, either around their legs or unfortunately on their trunks. And as anybody knows who's tried to find a forest elephant, they're not easy to find if they don't want you to find them. So those efforts aren't always successful. It's easier in the savanna. So conservation translocations as well. So being able to move animals from one place, perhaps where there might be too many, if there's successful conservation, to a place that could use a few more elephants, or moving them from places where there's not good protection, where there's poaching risks. And then there's dealing with elephants in rehabilitation centers, so like the Sheldrick Trust and a few others that are using that model. So these young elephants that are orphaned because of poaching, young elephants that fall into watering holes or wells and become separated from the herd. There's a couple of different sanctuaries that are helping to rehabilitate, and hopefully there's having some success with reintroducing and reintegrating them into the wild. So there's veterinary care offered there. And those, the more that we learn about elephant society and the roles of matriarchs, the more we can think about how important it is not just to preserve elephant populations as total numbers, but the roles that individuals play in those populations. So if you lose a matriarch, what does that do to a group of elephants? If you lose, from a purely scientific perspective, if you lose the reproductive capacity of an adult female, what does that do to the population trajectory? So we know that those that work with individual elephants to try to save individuals can have population level impacts that are positive. And so it's important work to do.
So Dale, I was impressed by, as you say, the great writing and the great storytelling in this book. And the question in my mind, maybe this is for everybody, is what kind of stories do you think will be most persuasive in getting people to care about elephants and to conserve elephants?
Is that addressed to me or to?
Well, you could. It's your book. You should probably start.
Yeah. No. I mean, for me, the most compelling stories are the ones that give elephants the depth of minds and emotions and character. And these are revealing stories. I mean, we talked about this. It's very, very hard to study the interior of another creature's mind. And that's one of the reasons that we don't know much about it. And it's one of the reasons that, for a long time, we haven't tried to study it. But there are stories, wonderful stories, that reveal these animals as being just highly emotional, which is what they are. And so I have some of that in the book. I also find, there are a couple of stories. One story in the book, it's not a story, it's actually a journalistic piece about the illegal trade in ivory that I find really just troubling and compelling. It's about the use of ivory in religious objects that is marketed in, the Philippines, and is a major problem with, using ivory, illegal ivory for religious objects like Madonnas and, baby Jesus, just seems to me such an offensive thing. So I find that a very compelling piece, just because it's so clear and direct and immediately and morally wrong. So I think that's answered your question.
Yeah, and I'm thinking in that context about the chapter about elephants' awareness of an interest in the ivory and skulls of dead elephants, and how there's some suggestion they may actually be able to identify the individuals that owned that ivory when it was when they were alive. And so Carl, you've written a lot about emotion and stories for in terms of our responses to animals. So what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think, we used to all think that every elephant was basically the same. It was only a numbers thing. Then we learned, females do this, males do that. Then we learned females live in family groups. And now we know that every individual in the family is known in a different way. And they have lives that are really, rather similar to us. They live with, in a context of individuals that they know. They usually know several hundred individuals. They try very hard to stay alive and keep their babies alive, and those groups stay together for decades. That's not an accident. Otherwise, you know, if you were randomly moving pieces, you would be all over the place. You wouldn't be together after decades. So I think that those stories of individuality and of showing the ways that individuals relate emotionally to other individuals are the most compelling. But I think there is one very big problem with that. You know, they're the most compelling to the human mind because we relate to individuals and we relate most to other human beings. So when we hear of another creature that is like us in some way, we make a better connection there. But elephants have really only two problems. One is people kill them, and the other is that people are pushing them off the face of the earth because there are just more and more and more people. The African elephant, for instance, has lost probably 99% of its numbers because it's lost about 90% of its habitat. And where they try to range or try to continue to migrate along routes that they have used for thousands of years, they find them suddenly blocked. I've been to places in Africa that took me days to get through when I first went there when I was in my 20s that are completely gone. And all you see from all horizons are flower fields and mustard farms, flowers that are cut for vases and tables in Europe, and mustard that goes into making mustard, I suppose. But what you don't see there are all of the thousands of creatures and plants and complex systems, including elephants, that lived there from way before anything that could be called a human took its knuckles off the dust. Now, that's a big story, and in a way, that story is too big for the human mind. So we can tell these stories about individuals and individuals helping and families and things like that. And that helps us to understand a little bit about what's at stake. But the magnitude of what's at stake seems to elude us. The world simply cannot coexist with 10 billion people who all want land, wood, water, dignity, and these things that everybody needs. We're too much of a good thing, and humans have become incompatible with the rest of the living world by sheer force of number. This is a story that is probably the most unpopular story you can tell about the human relationship with the rest of the living world. But you know, when you go running out to save an elephant that's been snared or speared or shot, or you see, as I have seen, in a place where they are 100% protected, an elephant that is one of the elephants that is being killed every single night I was there, with their face hacked off and blood still coming out of a hole in their head. You know, it's not just a story of elephants helping other elephants and nice human beings helping those that are injured. It's a story of us leaving no room in the world for other beings that are as of the world as we are. And that is a big story that is hard to get across. And the evidence that it's hard to get across is that the trend is worsening, despite the fact that some people have been telling this story in a very clear way for, depending on how you count, from anywhere from the last 50 years to the last 200 years, that people have talked about population and whether humans are leaving room for other animals. We've known since about 1800, we've known that other animals can go extinct, and we've documented hundreds of extinctions now. And yet that is accelerating. So the stories that best come across to people are really important. I would say they're crucial. They're the kinds of stories that I look for to convey also. But if they're not connected to the biggest picture, and if you think that taking a few elephants from here and putting them in a tiny little place over there that's no longer connected is going to solve the problem, then you're missing I think, the cause of the problem and why it's worsening.
Thank you for saying that. We all need to say that, and we all need to realize that, and I appreciate that tremendously. And you know, it's a very difficult thing to talk about because people don't want to hear it, as you say, and it's just a problem. And I don't know what the solution is, because the problem largely depends upon the nature of human character and maybe animal character. You always think of yourself first.
Well, I think actually we have a pretty good answer to the problem. If you look at demographics, you can see that there are now, only in the last few decades, there are now countries where the human population is not rising steeply. It's either flattening out or declining very slightly. And where do those tend to be? There's a close match to the places where women have achieved full citizenship. They can do everything that a citizen can do. They can own property, inherit property, own a business, borrow money, have a bank account, get an education, and make an independent living. And when they can make those choices, they make choices that we all of us who have choices tend to make. And the big secret of the rich part of the world is that small families give you a bigger life. And that's what women learn, and that's what they exert when they have the ability to make their own choices. So if I were starting out, or if I were talking to a young person starting out who said to me, I'm very passionate about everything, but I don't know exactly where to exert my main energies for a professional career that I'm going to have for the next 40 years, but I care desperately about conservation, I would say, well, women's dignity is the biggest lever. It solves the biggest problem among humans, and it solves the biggest problem in the human relationship with the rest of life on Earth. That's what I would tell them.
In other words, you would like to see humans more like elephants, who are in fact a matriarchal species.
Exactly.
I would, but I'd really like to see humans more like human beings. In fact, I'd like to see human beings become humane beings, where what we care about most is the dignity of the experience of being human, and fully exerting our capacity for compassion, for empathy, and for altruism, which we probably have generally a greater capacity of those things than other species, but we don't use it. We don't use it very often. We don't use it very consistently. We are the most extreme animal. We are the most compassionate, and we are the most creative, and we are the most destructive, and we are the cruelest, and we are all of those things all rolled up together all the time. And if we could really put the emphasis on being the better half of what we are capable of being, we could make being human and living in the world a really beautiful thing all the time, I think.
All right. Dale, any closing thoughts on your book and what it tells us about people? It certainly shows the best of people and the worst of people, as Carl says. And maybe in the short run, while we're waiting to become better people, there are other things that we can do to keep elephants going. In terms of,
in purely practical terms, COVID has been terrible for conservation and for elephants, because to the extent people like money, and it's a very large extent, tourism is the most compelling reason to leave room for elephants and all of the other animals there. And this year has knocked the wind out of that.
Mhm.
So, you know, those of us who are lucky enough to be able to travel or take a once in a lifetime trip, as soon as we are able and feel comfortable and it seems safe to be traveling again, traveling to wild places to see wild things is a very practical way to work on protecting them and giving them the kind of currency that a lot of people understand.
Yeah, I hope we can all do that soon. Well, I guess our hour has expired. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Felicia, and Carl and Dale, and thank you to Trinity University Press for putting on this event. And thank you to the many people who have tuned in tonight from all over the world. So thanks, everybody.
Thank
you,
you.
Bob, for the book.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be among you.